Jesus talks a lot about grace and forgiveness in the parables. He also talks a lot about judgment. He also has a lot of parables that teach us about, well, what the kingdom of heaven is really like. And what happens when you get all of those things together, all based around a question that one of the disciples asked, a question that even you and I so often, I'm sure, can ask as well. How often should we forgive? Especially when we live in a world where it's so easy to be angry at our neighbor, and where it seems like there's so much bad news that we're looking for someone to blame. That question of how often should I forgive, I think, is one that it's important that we look at. I think we'll be even pleasantly surprised that at the end of the parable, there's actually a lot of good news to be found. So true with Jesus, with his cross and the empty tomb, that when we follow the path and the journey with Jesus, there's a lot of good news to be found at the end of that road. My name is Reverend Andrew. This is St. James Presbyterian Church, and this is Matthew chapter 18, verses 21 to 35, the parable of the unforgiving servant. And so the part of the gospel that we're looking at here, again, is Matthew 18, verses 21 to 35. Here we have it all beginning with Jesus and Peter talking. You see, Peter came to Jesus and asked, "Lord, how often should I forgive someone who sins against me? 7 times?" "No, not 7 times," Jesus replied, "but 70 times 7. Then Jesus gives us a parable. It says this: "Therefore, the kingdom of heaven can be compared to a king who decided to bring his accounts up to date with servants who had borrowed money from him. In the process, one of his debtors was brought to him who owed 10,000 talents. He couldn't pay, so his master ordered that he be sold, along with his wife, his children, and everything he owned, all to pay the debt. But the man fell down before his master and begged him, 'Please be patient with me, and I will pay it all.' And then his master was filled with pity for him, and so he released him and forgave his debt. But then the man left the king, and he went to a fellow servant who owed him money, a few hundred, 100 denarius. He grabbed the man by the throat and demanded instant payment. His fellow servant fell down before him and begged for a little more time. 'Be patient with me,' he said, 'and I will pay it.' But his creditor wouldn't wait. He had the man arrested, put in prison, all until the debt could be paid in full. So when some of the servants saw this, they were very upset. They went to the king and told him everything that had happened. And then the king called the man that he had forgiven, and he said, 'You wicked servant, I forgave you that tremendous debt because you pleaded with me. Shouldn't you have mercy on your fellow servant, just as I had mercy on you?' And so then the angry king sent the man to prison to be tortured until he had his entire debt paid. And that is what my heavenly Father will do to you if you refuse to forgive your brothers and sisters from your heart." Now again, this is a parable that's dealing with a lot of things. It's a parable about the kingdom of heaven. There's a parable about, forgiveness there and grace. Certainly there's judgment all wrapped into it as well. It all began with that question that Peter asked: how many times should I forgive? That's such a hard question, too, because so often it's hard to forgive someone. The answer Jesus gives, even in the beginning, that sort of shrouded, kind of mysterious answer, the answer that's not really an answer at all of, 70 times 7, is meant to be that we keep forgiving. I think that's one of the hardest things. So often we want to say that we've done the job of forgiving and then it's over. Where I think actually forgiveness is about a posture. It's not about an act of it's once and done as much as it's about continuing to have that same position that you are forgiving them. Let's be honest. There's people in our lives who we could forgive, but at a quick turn, all of a sudden start holding that against them. Can you imagine if God did that with us? That God would say we're forgiven one day, but then have all of our sin, all of our debt held against us. In fact, that's what the parable itself is dealing with. You see these people, and it's a little tricky sometimes when we're talking about things like talents and denarius. These aren't types of funds or money. These aren't currencies that we use or even familiar with. So I did a little bit of math just to sort of work it out, because it was all based around sort of a day's labor and work. A denarius was exactly that. If you were a day laborer, kind of the equivalent of minimum wage, if you worked a full day, you would have a denarius. And so if you worked here in Nova Scotia and you worked for minimum wage, which currently, at least at the moment when I'm filming this, is $12.55 per hour, if you worked your full day's wage, you would have just a little under $95. According to my math, which many of you do know, math is not necessarily my strongest suit, but I can, the calculators carried me this far, is $94.13. And so if you take that and do the little bit of the math that you need to extrapolate that a little further, a denarius is the 94.13. And then, a talent, we don't really have a lot for that either, except a talent was considered what 20 years of labor was worth. That's an incredible sum of money. I mean, this is what you were looking at, sort of the idea of that your whole life, your whole working life would be to earn one talent. And so a talent in this case, and I've done a little bit of the figuring based on a little bit of kind of rounding with the numbers, but one talent is roughly, according to minimum wage in 2020 here right now, would be $489,476, just a little under the $500,000 mark. By a little bit, I mean about 17,000, but still, it's it's quite a sum of money. Now, when we think about these two men who had these debts, the first man who had this incredible debt, it talks about how he had 10,000 talents worth of debt to the king. Now, if you do the math and work that out, that's roughly just a little bit under 5 billion, 4,894,000,000, and some others beyond that. But let's just kind of round it off. Just say it's a little under $5 billion. If you're working minimum wage, that's a sum of money you're never going to see. It's a sum of money I'm never going to see in my life, let's be honest. It's an unpayable, it's an unsurmountable debt. And yet he is forgiven. He is let go. He is just set free. Can you imagine if you owed that much just to be having a blank slate? But the problem was, the man then turned around and went to someone who owed him money. And the sum that he owed him wasn't small. Again, according to current day figures, it was 100 denarius. If you do the math on that, you'll find out that's roughly about 9,500, not quite, a little under that. Certainly a big number, not an insurmountable amount. Something I think that you could pay off. Student loans, they certainly think I should be able to pay that a little bit more off in my lifetime. And yet, the man who was owed that sum, what should be payable, demanded it now and held it against in such a way that the person that he should have been forgiving, given that all he'd gone through, instead was found suffering. Now, I said this is a parable about judgment, and truly we see how judgment is on display here. The man who had been first judged to be set free was then judged fairly harshly, partially because that's how he held his brother. He judged him harshly, and so that was in turn turned back to him. It's also a parable about grace. We see that grace in full effect at the beginning, how an insurmountable debt would just be forgiven and let go, all because of that heart that the king had. Now, it's easy to see this as a parable and as a moment of teaching that's full of bad news. Certainly, it doesn't necessarily end on the highest of notes. This reminder that Jesus says about how we are to forgive one another, but also how if we don't forgive our brothers and sisters, how it's held against us. And yet, I said, there is good news at the end of this road. And I truly believe that. You see, because when we really stop and look at this parable, when we really stop and look at this section of Scripture, as much as it is about the forgiveness, and much as it's that reminder that we are to forgive, and that we're being held to a higher sort of standard in that, there's the reminder that we don't do it alone. And we're not called to blaze a trail as much as we are called to follow. We're called to follow Jesus himself, the one who came so that you and I would be forgiven, that through him, through a relationship with him, through knowing him, we would know the Father, and we would know what that kingly grace is like. Now, I also talked about how this parable, I think, has a lot to tell us here and now today. And I think certainly over the last number of years, it's so often that people want to find themselves on the right team. So often we like to draw lines in the sand and be on one side or the other. Now, that's all great when it comes to things like sports teams, when it's, you're picking hockey teams or basketball teams. But when you start picking with people's lives, being for and against, and when we forget that real people suffer and that there's real consequences to that, I think we all need to be able to step back and be reminded that grace and forgiveness and love are things that pay out in a far greater amount of return and interest than what we sometimes put in, and certainly what we remember. The thing is, we need that grace. We need to be shown that grace. God shows it to us, but as Christians and as the church, we're called to show it as well, to be God and to be God's ambassadors in the world. I've also lately been talking a lot about head and heart and hands, and how all three need to serve the kingdom. And I think here we can see how all three need to come together in order to show that grace, be it through word, through deed, be it by actually having our own hearts changed, by having our minds let go of those old hurts, and having our hands reach out and perhaps form bridges where old ones had been burned. The challenge of it is that that's not easy. But following Jesus was never promised to be easy. What we're promised is that we'll find life at the end of that journey. That we'll find that good news. That we'll find something so worth sharing. It was far more valuable than what we ever thought was even possible. Far more than even a debt of 5 billion or whatever. Because what we would find is life. And so Jesus is inviting you into that life, into finding that good news. Part of it means having our heart changed and transformed, to be willing to accept his forgiveness, but also to give his forgiveness to others. May you know his grace. May you know his forgiveness. Thank you so much for joining us. May you keep journeying with him. May you find that good news at the end. God bless. Bye-bye.